How did families on the frontier protect their huts at night? Now you will learn all the secrets that saved people's lives. As the sun sets, civilization disappears, and the only sounds left are the howling wind and the crackling fire in the hearth. For settler families, night was not a time of rest, but a daily test of survival, where any mistake could be their last. Their homes were not just dwellings, but fortresses built with wood, clay, and unyielding will, thought out down to the smallest detail. Every detail, from the location of the window to the thickness of the door bolt, was part of a silent but vital security system. It was architecture born not of comfort, but of necessity. Watch the video to the end to learn how a simple wooden shutter could be more reliable than a steel lock, and why silence inside a hut was valued much more than a loaded gun above the fireplace. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the frontier, which had nothing to do with weapons. The settler's main defense was not the thickness of the walls, but his own consciousness, rebuilt according to the laws of the wild. Night transformed the familiar landscape into hostile, unknown territory, full of imagined and real threats. A person who could not control his mind was doomed to destruction even behind the strongest walls. Every rustle behind the wall, every crack of a branch in the forest, every movement in the darkness passed through the strict internal filter of an experienced settler. Settlers learned to distinguish the sound of a fox's footsteps from the cautious steps of a human, and a gust of wind from the quiet creak of a floorboard on the porch. Their hearing became the main early warning tool that could save the lives of the entire family. Over the years of living on the edge of civilization, they developed the ability to hear danger from dozens of meters away. Experienced frontiersmen could determine not only the type of threat by the sound, but also its approximate distance from the house. The pounding of a horse's hooves meant one thing, while a cautious movement through the bushes meant quite another. The howl of a wolf differed from the cry of a cougar in its special intonations. Each of these sounds required its own response and its own level of readiness. That is why, when darkness fell, almost complete silence reigned inside the hut, broken only by the crackling of wood in the hearth. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, barely audible whispers, and any movements were slow and cautious so as not to creak the floorboards. The family became a single organism, listening intently to the sounds of the night and ready to act in unison at any moment. Even babies were taught not to cry loudly after sunset. The mother could breastfeed her child while keeping her hand on her husband's loaded rifle. The father of the family often dozed off in fits and starts, remaining constantly ready to jump up at the first sign of danger. The older children took up their positions at the loopholes or slits in the walls. This distribution of responsibilities allowed them to control all approaches to the dwelling. This constant focus on the surrounding world created a special psychological state that modern psychologists would call hypervigilance. It was a mixture of heightened alertness, calm readiness, and fatalism in the face of inevitable danger. Panic was the main enemy, capable of destroying any defense system, even the most perfect one, and ruining the entire family. Settlers learned to accept the possibility of death as part of their life on the frontier. This philosophy helped them maintain clarity of thought even in critical moments of attack. A person who had resigned himself to the possibility of death in advance acted much more effectively than one who clung to life in panic. They said that fear of death kills faster than a bullet or a tomahawk. Accepting risk freed the mind to act correctly. From an early age, children were taught this nighttime discipline through strict but necessary upbringing. They understood that after sunset, games and loud laughter ended, giving way to watchful silence. This was not just a rule set by parents, but an immutable law of survival that was absorbed with their mother's milk. A child who did not learn this lesson became a threat to the whole family. Young children were taught special games that developed their ability to sit still and quietly for long periods of time. Competitions in silent movement around the house were commonplace. The ability to control one's breathing and not make a sound was encouraged. These skills could one day save their lives in the event of an attack. Families developed their own systems of code signals that only members of their clan could understand. A quiet cough from the father or a certain movement from the mother could convey information about danger and the level of threat without words. This silent communication was vital at times when any loud noise could give away their presence to the enemy. A touch on the shoulder could mean an order to load a weapon, and a special hand gesture warned of movement outside. Some families used a system of light taps on the walls or floor to convey messages. One tap could mean a false alarm, two warned of real danger, and three meant the need to immediately take up defensive positions. Such codes changed from time to time in case they were discovered by enemies. Children learned these signals before they learned the alphabet. The light from the hearth was also part of this psychological game and required skillful handling. It provided a sense of security and warmth inside, but at the same time blinded the inhabitants of the hut to what was happening outside in the darkness. Therefore, the fire was often deliberately dimmed, leaving only smoldering coals so that the eyes could adjust to the darkness and see the silhouettes outside the window. Bright light turned windows into mirrors behind which any danger could lurk. Experienced settlers learned to use light as a tactical advantage. They could suddenly fan the flames to blind an enemy looking into the window from the darkness, or, conversely, extinguish all sources of light to disorient attackers. Some installed fake lamps by the windows, creating the illusion of people being present in certain places. Many settlers kept not only firearms at the ready, but also simple household items that could be deadly in skilled hands. A heavy cast iron skillet, an iron poker, or boiling water from a kettle could be effective weapons in close combat inside the confined space of a cabin. The willingness to use any object as a weapon was an integral part of the frontier man's defensive mindset. Women were particularly skilled at using household items for defense. The axe for chopping wood was always kept in a specific place where it could be reached in the dark. The knife for cutting meat was kept razor sharp. Even an ordinary bucket of water could be thrown in an attacker's face. Settlers turned their homes into arsenals where every object had a dual purpose. Windows and doors were not just openings in the walls, but dangerous boundaries between safety and the unknown outside world. The family always positioned themselves inside the hut so as not to be in direct line of sight from these openings, avoiding becoming an easy target. It was an instinctive rule that saved lives and was passed down from generation to generation. Experienced settlers never lit a candle directly in front of a window or stood in a doorway for more than a second. Sleeping places were chosen in the most protected corners of the house, away from the outer walls. Children slept in the inner rooms, if there were any, or in the center of the only room. Adults were placed closer to potential points of entry. This arrangement provided precious seconds in the event of a sudden attack. Thus, the first and main line of defense was not along the perimeter of the property, but in the minds of each family member, in their ability to think and act as one. The ability to control their fear, trust their instincts, and act calmly in the face of mortal danger was their most valuable asset, one that money could not buy. Psychological preparation was worth more than the most sophisticated weapons of the time. Families with a strong spirit survived where the weak-minded perished despite thick walls and numerous guns. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this psychological approach to survival? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about why some huts stood for decades while others disappeared overnight? The secret lay not only in psychology, but also in the fundamental principles of construction. Choosing a location for a future home was the first and perhaps most important decision in a defense strategy. A small hill or elevation was considered the ideal location. This provided a good view of the surrounding area for hundreds of meters around. Any movement approaching the hut would be noticed long before it could pose a threat. Location near a water source, such as a stream or river, was vital. However, the hut was never built close to the water or dense vegetation on the shore. This was done to deprive a potential enemy of the opportunity to approach unnoticed under the cover of the terrain. The walls of the hut were themselves a powerful defensive structure. They were made of thick sanded logs carefully fitted together. The space between the logs was caulked with moss, clay, and mud, creating a virtually monolithic structure. Such walls were not only warm, but also incredibly strong. It was extremely difficult to break through them, even with heavy tools. They provided reliable protection from the weather and uninvited guests. The roof was often made of heavy wooden planks covered with turf. This design was not only a good heat insulator, but also highly fire-resistant. It was much more difficult to set fire to such a green roof than a conventional thatched or shingle roof. There was usually no foundation in the modern sense. The hut was placed on large boulders at the corners, which protected the lower log crowns from rotting. However, this created a vulnerable space under the floor, which required special attention. The floor was made of thick, tightly fitted boards. The settlers took great care to ensure that there were no holes under the house through which someone could get inside. Sometimes stones were laid around the perimeter under the floor to prevent digging. The chimney was another strategically important element. It was built from rough stone, held together with clay mortar. Wide and massive, it not only effectively removed smoke, but also served as an additional stiffening element for the entire structure. Building such a fortified hut was a long and laborious process that required enormous effort from the whole family. But every nail hammered in and every log laid was a contribution to their overall safety. It was a house built to protect, but even the thickest walls are useless if they have weak spots. Ready to learn how the settlers turned the space outside the hut into their first line of defense? What the experts don't mention is that the defense of the hut did not begin at the walls, but 100 meters away from them. Creating a clear zone around the dwelling was the first rule of safety that every settler learned. It was a carefully thought-out system that turned the surrounding landscape into an ally. The first thing to do was to completely clear the forest and dense shrubbery around the chosen construction site for a considerable distance. This created an open, easily visible space with a radius of 50 to 100 meters, depending on the terrain. Any figure appearing in this field during the day or on a moonlit night would be clearly visible. Such clearing required weeks of hard work by the whole family. Trees were felled so that their trunks fell away from the house, creating additional temporary obstacles. The wood was not discarded, but used for building houses, fences, and as fuel for long winters. Stumps and large boulders that could serve as cover for attackers were also carefully uprooted or removed with particular diligence. The goal was to create the flattest and smoothest surface possible, giving the enemy no chance to approach unnoticed or take a breather under fire. This turned the approach to the house into a kill zone where the defenders had an absolute advantage. Even small depressions in the ground were leveled. Any fold in the terrain that could hide a person was considered a potential threat. Settlers often checked their work by lying down on the ground at various points around the perimeter and assessing visibility from human height. The next step was to erect a simple fence along the border of the cleared area. Often it was not a tall and powerful palisade, requiring enormous labor, but a so-called zigzag fence made of long poles and split logs. Its main purpose was not to physically stop a determined enemy, but to slow down their advance and force them to make loud noises when crossing it. Such a fence was easy to build and repair, even for one person. It did not require the laborious digging of heavy posts into the ground. The poles were simply laid on top of each other at an angle in a characteristic zigzag shape. Overcoming such an obstacle, especially in the pitch darkness of night or in a hurry, was a slow and noisy business, giving the defenders time to prepare. The height of such a fence rarely exceeded 1 or 1.5 meters, but this was enough to slow down the pace of the attack and disorganize the attackers. Some settlers deliberately left weak spots in the fence to direct the enemy into a predetermined area. Sometimes thorny shrubs such as hawthorn, blackberry, or wild rose with their long thorns were planted along the outer perimeter of the cleared area. Growing over several years, they created a dense hedge as tall as a man. It was almost impossible to pass through such a barrier without making noise, getting scratched, or tearing your clothes. It was a natural version of barbed wire that required no maintenance and was constantly renewed. In the spring, these bushes bloomed, making the estate beautiful and peaceful in appearance. But at night, they turned into a deadly trap for uninvited guests. The path leading to the house from the edge of the property was never a straight line. It was deliberately made winding, with several sharp turns to prevent attackers from firing accurately at the front door from a long distance. Each bend in the path was carefully calculated to make it as difficult as possible for attackers and give defenders a tactical advantage. Individual trees were often left on either side of the path, or posts were erected. These served as landmarks during the day, but at night they could cause confusion for those who did not know the exact route. Some cunning builders created false branches of the path leading into thickets or to cliffs. When choosing a location for construction, they always tried to include a well or natural water source within the defensive perimeter. If this was physically impossible due to the terrain, they dug a covered trench or built a protected corridor of logs. Control of the water source during a long siege was literally a matter of life and death for the entire family. Some settlers dug an additional reserve well directly under the floor of the house. It was laborious work, but it guaranteed water even during a complete blockade. In extreme cases, they stored water in barrels inside the dwelling. Sometimes settlers resorted to simple but surprisingly effective tricks based on knowledge of human nature. For example, dry branches, twigs, and rustling leaves could be deliberately scattered around the perimeter of the cleared area around the house in a layer several centimeters thick. Any person or large animal that tried to approach the hut at night would inevitably give themselves away with a loud crunch and rustle that could not be muffled. In some places, tension traps made of ropes were installed. If an uninvited guest touched such a rope in the dark, they could knock over the suspended object, creating noise. These were primitive but effective alarm systems that worked without human intervention. Domestic animals, if the family had them, also played an important role in the early warning system. At night, the animals were always herded into a barn or pen within sight of the house, usually 20 to 30 meters away. Their restlessness, sudden neighing of horses, mooing of cows, or barking of dogs could serve as a reliable signal of the approach of strangers or predators long before they appeared in sight. Experienced settlers knew the sounds of their animals and could determine the type of threat by the nature of their agitation. Wolves caused one reaction in livestock, bears another, and the approach of people a third. Dogs were especially valuable because they could smell strangers hundreds of meters away and warn their owners in advance. Some kept geese, which were considered the best guards. These birds made an incredible noise at the sight of a stranger and slept very lightly. According to legend, it was geese that once saved Rome from the attack of the Gauls, and American settlers remembered this story. Thus, settlers did not simply live in wooden huts in the middle of the wilderness, but in the center of a multi-layered defense system built with intelligence. Every element of the landscape, every detail on the site worked toward a single goal: to give the family precious minutes and seconds to prepare to defend themselves and repel an attack. It was an invisible fortress, built not of stone, but of foresight and a deep understanding of the psychology of attackers. What if I told you that the entire defense of the hut rested on a single piece of wood? The door was the alpha and omega of security, the most vulnerable and at the same time the most fortified place in the house. Its construction and protection were approached with particular care. The door was made not from one, but from 2 or 3 layers of thick, tightly packed boards. Moreover, the layers were arranged perpendicular to each other. This design was resistant to attempts to break through it with an axe or other tool. It did not hang on ordinary hinges, which could be easily knocked off. Instead, massive forged hinges were used, which were attached to the door leaf and jamb with long bolts. These bolts passed through the entire thickness of the logs and were bent on the inside. But the main element of protection was not the lock, but a heavy oak or pine bolt. It was a massive beam that was inserted into deep grooves carved into the wall logs on both sides of the door. When closed, it turned the door and wall into a single unit. This bolt was often double or even triple. One was located at waist level, the other at shoulder level. This system evenly distributed the load when attempting to break down the door and made it virtually impenetrable. Sometimes a small camouflage peephole was made in the door itself. It allowed the occupants to assess the situation outside without opening the door and revealing their presence. It was a simple but effective door peephole of the frontier era. The doorway was always made lower than human height. This forced anyone entering to instinctively bend down. In this position, a person was more vulnerable and less capable of a quick attack. The threshold was made high. This was not only to protect against drafts and snow. The high threshold forced the person entering to lift their foot, which momentarily disrupted their balance and slowed their movement. Sometimes additional elements were attached to the inside of the door. These could be chains or hooks that allowed the door to be opened a small crack, but prevented it from being opened completely. This was useful for negotiating with strangers. The process of locking the door at night was a real ritual. A heavy bolt slid into the groove with a dull thud, giving the inhabitants of the hut a fragile sense of security. This sound was the last chord of the day and the first line of nighttime defense. But the door was not the only opening in the wall. In the next chapter, you will learn how the settlers solved the dilemma of windows, how to let light into the house without letting in mortal danger. Ready to learn more? Windows were a necessary luxury and a constant headache for frontier builders. They provided precious daylight, but every opening in the wall was a potential breach in the defenses. Therefore, the design of windows was a compromise between comfort and safety. The windows in the settlers' huts were always very small. They were barely large enough to stick your head through. This was done to make it as difficult as possible to get inside. They were not placed at eye level, but significantly higher. Firstly, this arrangement made it difficult to see the interior of the hut from the outside. Secondly, in order to look into such a window, one had to come close to the wall, which made the observer vulnerable. Glass was extremely rare and valuable on the frontier. Most often, window openings were covered with oiled paper or thinly tanned leather. These materials allowed enough light to pass through, but did not allow a clear view of what was happening inside. The main element of window protection was massive internal shutters. They were made of thick boards, sometimes reinforced with iron. At night, the shutters were tightly closed and secured with a sturdy wooden bolt. Such a shutter turned the window into an extension of the wall. It was capable of withstanding significant external impact. It was absolutely impossible to open it from the outside. In some huts, especially in areas with a high degree of threat, loopholes were made instead of ordinary windows. These were narrow vertical or horizontal slits in the walls. They allowed fire to be directed from the inside while remaining virtually invulnerable. The loopholes were located at different heights. This allowed firing both standing and kneeling. They were placed in such a way as to provide a circular view and leave no dead zones around the hut. The design of the loopholes was thought out to the smallest detail. The opening widened inward, giving the shooter a wide firing sector. From the outside, the slit remained minimal, making it a very difficult target. Sometimes the loopholes were camouflaged. They could be covered with a piece of bark or a bunch of moss. At the right moment, this cover could be easily removed from the inside, opening fire on the enemy by surprise. Thus, each opening in the wall was not just a window, but an element of a tactical system. During the day, it provided light, and at night it turned into either a blank wall or a firing point. It was a dual function built into the very architecture of survival. What if I told you that the most formidable weapon in a settler's hut did not hang on the wall but stood by the stove? When all the bolts were locked and the shutters closed, it was time for the arsenal of last resort, and it was much more diverse than one might imagine. Of course, the main weapon was the long-barreled rifle, which was usually kept above the fireplace. It was an accurate and powerful weapon, but it had its drawbacks. In close combat inside a cramped cabin, it was cumbersome and slow to reload. Therefore, every member of the family capable of holding a weapon had a role to play in the defense. While the man handled the rifle at the loophole, the woman and older children prepared another arsenal for battle. It consisted of items that were at hand every day. A heavy axe for chopping wood was a formidable weapon in close combat. Its weight and sharp blade could stop any opponent. It always stood in the corner, ready to be used not only for its intended purpose. Ordinary pitchforks or hatchets also became effective means of defense. The long handle allowed the enemy to be kept at a distance. This was especially important when defending a door or window opening. But the most accessible and unexpected weapon was boiling water. A large pot of water always stood on the fire in the hearth. At a critical moment, its contents could be splashed on anyone who tried to break in. Even furniture played a role in defense. A heavy oak table could be overturned and used as an additional barricade. Chairs and benches could become improvised weapons or a means of blocking the door. Pokes, tongs, and other heavy metal stove utensils were always at hand. In skilled hands, they turned into something like medieval clubs and pins. Their effectiveness in confined spaces was very high. Bags of sand or ash from the hearth were also part of this arsenal. Thrown in the face, they could temporarily blind the enemy. This gave the defenders precious seconds to counterattack. The family assigned roles and positions in advance. Everyone knew where they should be and what to do in case of an attack. This coordination and readiness to use any object were no less important than the availability of firearms. In this way, the entire hut was transformed into a single defensive space where every object had a dual purpose. It was a total defense based on ingenuity and the maximum use of available resources. Now imagine that all these weapons were useless without the most important skill. In the next chapter, you will learn about nighttime rituals that were more important than any barricade. Security on the frontier was not a state, but a process, a set of daily actions honed to perfection. With the last rays of the sun, the family began their nightly ritual, turning their home into an impregnable fortress. Each action had its own meaning and was performed in strict sequence. It all started outside while there was still enough light to work. Any livestock had to be brought into shelter, and all tools, implements, and any useful items had to be removed from the yard. Any item left outside through carelessness could be used by the enemy as a weapon or cover. Axes, shovels, rakes. All of this was locked away in the shed or brought into the house. Even an ordinary ladder leaning against the wall could help attackers climb onto the roof. Firewood was stacked so that it could not be used for cover when approaching the house. This was followed by a thorough inspection of the perimeter of the entire territory. The head of the family slowly walked around the hut, carefully examining the surroundings and listening to the sounds of the evening forest. He checked the integrity of the fence, looked for traces of strangers, and made sure there was nothing suspicious around. Particular attention was paid to places where a person could hide. The bushes near the house, the piles of firewood, the corners of the barn. Everything was examined with the utmost care. If something looked different from yesterday, it was immediately investigated. The next step was to collect water for the whole night. It was necessary to bring enough water from the well or stream to the house for drinking, cooking, and in case of fire. Going outside after dark was strictly forbidden for all family members without exception. Water was collected in reserve, usually filling several large wooden buckets and barrels. In the event of a siege, this reserve could be a lifesaver. Some prudent settlers kept water in several places in the house in case some of it spilled in the dark. After that, the family gathered inside the hut, and the process of sealing the dwelling from the outside world began. First, all the shutters on the windows were tightly closed and locked with heavy wooden bolts. The house was plunged into thick semi-darkness, lit only by the orange fire in the hearth and possibly a single dim candle. The shutters were checked for strength. They were pulled to make sure the bolts were holding firmly. The gaps between the boards were plugged with rags so that the light from inside would not reveal the presence of awake people. If a shutter creaked, it was lubricated with grease so that it could be opened silently if necessary. Then came the most crucial moment of the whole ritual: locking the front door. A heavy oak beam as thick as a human arm was inserted with a dull thud into iron grooves on both sides of the doorway. Often it was additionally propped up with another beam at an angle or a heavy piece of furniture, a table or a chest with supplies. Some doors had several levels of protection. First, one bolt was pushed in at the bottom, then the middle one, then the top one. Each of them was at least 10 centimeters thick. After the hut was securely locked on all sides, the entire arsenal of weapons was checked. A rifle or musket was taken down from the wall, the powder and bullets were carefully checked, and it was placed in the most accessible place, usually near the head of the family's sleeping place. An axe for chopping wood, sharp pitchforks, and other improvised means of defense occupied their predetermined positions near different walls of the house. Spare powder charges, bullets, and flints for striking sparks were kept in a dry place so that the weapons would not fail at a critical moment. Every adult member of the family always had a knife at hand. Even children knew where their weapons were, usually a club or a stone. The fire in the hearth was deliberately kept to a minimum. The bright, cheerfully dancing flames were intentionally replaced by smoldering red coals, which provided enough heat for warmth but minimal light that did not blind the eyes. This allowed the eyes to gradually adjust to the darkness and better see the silhouettes and movements outside the window in the moonlight. Sometimes the fire was extinguished almost completely, leaving only a tiny spark under the ashes. It could be quickly fanned into a flame if necessary, but it did not reveal the presence of people. On particularly dangerous nights, they did without fire altogether. The family took their places for the night according to a pre-planned arrangement. No one slept close to the outer walls or directly opposite the windows and front door where a bullet could hit. They positioned themselves so as to minimize the risk of accidental injury from a shot from outside or during a sudden invasion. The children slept in the most protected place, usually in the far corner of the room. The mother lay next to them, ready to shield them at any moment. The father took up a position closer to the door, from where he could control the situation. Adult family members often took turns sleeping, especially during times of unrest or when there were rumors of Indian raids in the area. While one rested and regained strength, the other sat in complete silence, listening intently to every nighttime sound outside. This watchful sleep allowed the family to remain constantly alert throughout the long night without lapses in attention. The person on duty usually sat on a chair near the window or embrasure, keeping their weapon at the ready. They listened not only to the sounds outside, but also to the breathing of the sleeping family members. If anyone woke up in distress, they would calm them with a quiet whisper. This ritual, honed over years, was not just a set of practical precautions against real threats. It had enormous psychological significance for the whole family, especially the children. The consistent performance of familiar actions calmed the nerves and gave a sense of control over a dangerous situation, dispelling the paralyzing fear and panic that could cost lives. We see that protecting a cabin on the frontier was not just a set of defensive measures, but a whole philosophy of life. It began with choosing the right location, continued in every detail of construction, and manifested itself in daily rituals. It was a system in which psychology, architecture, and knowledge of nature were inextricably linked. Settlers turned their homes into veritable fortresses and the surrounding landscape into their ally. They learned to listen to the night, control light, and trust their intuition. Their main weapons were not steel, but foresight, composure, and a willingness to defend their homes to the last. These lessons in survival, born in the harsh conditions of the Wild West, demonstrate the incredible ability of humans to adapt. They remind us that safety is not a given, but the result of constant effort and a deep understanding of the world around us. Which of these defense methods did you find most inventive? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the mysteries of the American frontier.